Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India, at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce our next session, The World That Belongs to Us. In a session on the political and poetic articulation of the right to belong, poets Akhil Katyal and Meena Kandasamy come together to discuss the voice, strength, and cadence of diversity and difference with Mandira Nayar. Katyal is a bilingual poet, translator, and educator who works to enable activism and conversations about politics and sexuality through the power of words. He has co-edited The World That Belongs to Us, an anthology of queer poetry from South Asia, a remarkable singular collection of contemporary queer poetry and expression in the Indian subcontinent. Meena Kandasamy is an anti-caste activist, poet, novelist, and translator who aims to deconstruct the trauma and violence of oppression and the means of resistance thus born. Her works include When I Hit You, Exquisite Cadavers, and a recent collection of essays, The Orders Were to Rape You, Tamil Tigresses in the Eelam Struggle. Akhil Katyal is a Delhi-based writer and translator who has authored books like Blood on the Bitten Tongue, Delhi Poems, and How Many Countries Does the Indus Cross? He has also translated Ravish Kumar's book of prose poems, Ishq Mein Sheher Hona, as a city happens in love. Akhil was the International Writing Fellow at the University of Iowa in fall 2016 and was awarded the Vijay Nambisan Poetry Fellowship for the year 2021. Meena Kandasamy is an anti-caste activist, poet, novelist, and translator. She deconstructs trauma and violence, most notably in her books of poems Touch and Miss Militancy. Her novels have been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, International Dylan Thomas Prize, Jhalak Prize, and the Hindu Lit Prize. Mandira Nayar, our moderator today, has been a journalist for nearly 2 decades. She currently works with The Week magazine, writing on books, history, culture, and foreign affairs. She has worked with The Hindu and The Telegraph and is a Charles Wallace scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, The World That Belongs to Us, Akhil Katyal, Meena Kandasamy in conversation with Mandira Nayar.
No, right? Always takes a while for this to get. Hello? Yeah, okay. So it's wonderful to see a packed hall, and I'm hope, and you know, it's encouraging because it's always about poetry, and both of these are really wonderful poets. So we're going to do a lot of reading here. And I wanted to start off by saying that, as you know, I mean, you've read their bios, they wear many hats. And since it is about poetry, I thought we should really start off and get into it. And so Akhil is going to read something for us, and then Meena is going to respond.
I want to start with reading 2 companion poems. This poem was written a few years ago for Dr. Ramchandra Srinivas Siras, who all of you would know. It's been about 12 years since he left us. And this was a poem when I was looking for a house to rent in Delhi, drawing on some of the experiences of a queer elder that Dr. Srinivas Siras was for me. I'd written this poem. And after that, I'll read a poem by Dr. Siras, which concludes the queer anthology, which is translated very ably by Anish, who's in the audience today. Aligarh. On 8th February 2010, 2 men forced their way into Dr. Ramchandra Siras's house and shot a video of him in bed with another man. The next day, Siras, a professor of Marathi literature, was suspended by Aligarh Muslim University for gross misconduct. The courts ruled against the university, giving Siras his job back. On 7th April that year, Siras died in a rented house under mysterious circumstances, a day before the letter revoking his suspension arrived in the office. Dr. Siras, in those nights, you must have felt loneliness like a drip. The walls of your room held together by a faint song, past loves sitting by you, combing the hours. That poem, Dr. Siras, where you ask the beloved moon not to fear the dawn that separates us, where you seek consolation even from shadows. I read it last night on the terrace. It held my hands. We will dance as shadows dance. It let grass grow under my feet. We will touch as shadows touch. It hurt my morning into dewdrops. Dr. Siras, in my Delhi Barsati, the windows open onto a palash tree. I was 27 when I first moved into it. The landlord did not pause at the word bachelor. He only asked if I had too many parties. I didn't. I got the house. But next time, Dr. Siras, when I look for a place in this city, I'll be older. I was born the year you got your PhD, and they'll pause at marriage. I'll try to draw respect from a right surname, from saying teacher, from telling them my birthplace, and will try and hide my feeling small under my feet. You had said you were always unseen in the light of day. What did you say, Dr. Siras, when you looked for that house in Durgavadi? What did you tell the neighbors? Teacher, professor, poet? What gives us this respect, Dr. Siras, this contract with water? In those nights, weighing this word in your hands, you must have felt weak. You must have closed the windows to keep out the evening. You must have looked back and hung the song in the air between refusal and letting go. And when we were editing the anthology, which became The World That Belongs to Us, Anthology of Queer Poetry from South Asia, we were really trying to find Dr. Siras's work because he was a celebrated poet. He was awarded by the Maharashtra Sahitya Parishad. And finally, it was absolutely amazing and great when Anish finally contributed their translation of Dr. Siras's work. And no wonder that Dr. Siras in this Marathi poem is also trying to find a refuge, a kind of shelter for the desire. The poem is called Rooms to Sleep In, translated from Marathi by Anish Gawande. He's already bathed in sweat. It's very hot after all. He shows me work of his dreams completed just today. Beyond are rooms to sleep in. When this house lay unbuilt, no money and no constraints of diktats of the previous owner's incomplete dreams, I told him, don't block the mountains with windows or walls even. Let them come right into the house, not like guests, but family. But his obstinate, mad love for solitude wants not flowers on the steps below, wants not tunes in middle octaves. Here, only those rooms to sleep in, only those were built for a purpose. There, wind, silence, softness, and that parvana of easy dream journeys wants not magical colors and unfiltered compositions of sunlight and draws to keep sleeping pills. He has built for himself. He has built for himself, for what remains of his life, a grave as beautiful as Epiphanies. He calls it rooms to sleep in. Dr. Siras.
I said it's really beautiful. I've read it, but when you read it, again, it was sort of, I don't know, goosebumpy. And I wanted to ask Meena to read her poem and talk about, which talks about honor killing, and then we can get into the next segment, please.
Actually, I was reading The World That Belongs to Us, which is also the title of our, just wanted to hold up and show the book. It's a brilliant book. And talk about contested love. And contested love in the categories of, being queer, bisexual, gay, all of this. But also contested love in the context of, intercaste, interreligious relationships. So I have a small poem here called The Seven Stages. And I think it would speak to this work. The 7 stages. Notes to self. Don't lose him. Don't lose yourself. Don't lose. Note to lover. Remember this. Nothing else will matter soon. Note to my readers. Take up this dream. Turn it on its head. Hub un ishq akidat ibadat junoon maut. These are the 7 stages of love in another tongue, but some dark men from my land have lived through this as if poetic delineation in Urdu was based on Tamil souls. It always starts with a silent man locking eyes with a talkative girl prone to sudden smiles. Attraction turns to infatuation, turns into love quite quickly. That's the fluff of films, then society intervenes with its caste codes, sequesters them, separates them. Robbed of 2 years and 2 million kisses, this longing turns to reverence and worship and obsession. The lovers rebel, they elope, they marry, they live like rabbits, delicate and lovely, mostly underground and always making love. Soon discovered, they are slaughtered. They dared to defy, but ended up dead. Take up this dream, turn it on its head. Sorry.
So, I wanted to talk to both of you about forbidden love. In some ways, this is both about longing, it's about loss, it's about loving, it's about forbidden. In yours, I mean, both of them, it's about violence also, right? And you both find that, I mean, in the anthology, you managed to find space in this about violence and saying, how do you sort of find that space? And Meena, you've always been able to talk about violence and about marginalizing. Your first book was really about violence, about all this. So how do you sort of fit that in? How does that work? And can you talk about being on the margins and the violence that it evokes? I mean, sorry, that you're forced.
I think a lot of, for those who write political poetry, a lot of what you write is dependent on the context in which you write or what is happening around you.
Yeah.
And as much as I'm very proud to be from Tamil Nadu, which is a very progressive state, we also have a culture of honor killings that we have been witnessing. Especially as a young person growing up, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's always a spate of honor killings whenever there are star-crossed lovers. So I think this poem comes from, and then when you look at it, okay, we can look at this as an isolated incident, okay, this is some, like in Dharmapuri, there was a Dalit man called Leelavarasan who falls in love with a 1-year girl, they get married, and then 300 homes of Dalit people are burnt in retaliation because of this marriage. But then you have to understand there's a larger system that kind of supports this. And that is this actual violence is one sort of violence, but the other violence is the structural ideological violence, which is based on religion, which says that, endogamy shouldn't happen, caste mixing shouldn't happen. And this is what religion does to you. So for me, to unpack violence is to unpack both of this and to unpack not only violence in terms of, caste, but also the violence that happens on women's bodies. So I think this is where I am coming from, and this poem is coming from, which I think, also speaks to Akhil and, what is sanctioned by religion, what is sanctioned by society, and how people pay the price. This is a very dangerous price of love, because you love, and then the answer that society gives you is death. So it becomes a very precarious thing, almost a rebellion.
No, it's absolutely strange that while there is, and in a book which is about love and loss and resilience and euphoria and courage, there are very distinct forms of violence that people are negotiating, whether it's a violence of their own city, which abandons and brutalizes them in very particular ways, particularly as queer people, whether it's a violence from those who are near and dear to them. Those people with whose support they sustain themselves are also the people who corrode them. And this could be family members, this could be past lovers. But one of the biggest forms of violence was also the violence of definition. Like, a lot of folks had a very narrow understanding of what a queer poem could be. And we were sort of tussling between those narrow definitions. I remember ages ago, there was a Ugandan asylum seeker in the UK, and she had made this application to the immigration board in the United Kingdom and said that because I'm a lesbian woman, I find it hard to sustain any form of full life in my country, and I'm applying on the basis of that application. Matthew Coates, who was the immigration judge at that point in the UK, rejected that application saying, well, in the time that you have stayed in the UK, you have not lived like a lesbian. And what did he mean by that? You have not been to the lesbian clubs, you have not read lesbian magazines, you have not accessed that popular culture which comes under this narrow mantle called lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So one of the things that we were constantly tussling with, especially when creating this book, is that folks understood queerness only within certain parameters, and just the content of the book was militating against each of those parameters. So I thought maybe I could read a poem by this startling and amazing poet called Dhiren Borisa. And they are a poet, they're a social geographer, they teach at Jindal University now. And their PhD work was also on kind of urban cartography of gay male desire in a city like Delhi. And they wrote this poem, and it does not give you queerness on a platter, right? It does not give you some expected tropes that you might expect of the word gay or the word lesbian or the word bisexual or trans. They wrote this poem after Rohit Vemula had passed away. And in thinking about that lamentation, that survival, that mourning, they found a vocabulary for the negotiations that Dalit queer people were making on an everyday basis, right? And in fact, very eloquently, when they speak about this poem, at one point they say that to be Dalit is to be queer even in queer spaces. Because caste is such a, it's such a kind of instinctive interface, like which, whether you're queer, whether you're not queer, you are each sort of accessing, you are each sort of making sense of the other person through that frame, through that, it's almost like this, caste is this guiding blueprint which they wanted to explode in this poem. I'll read out the poem, I thought, and this they submitted as a queer poem, right? So keep that in mind. Should I mourn a little longer? Ab matam aur manaun kya? Should I mourn a little longer after Rohit Vemula? Should I mourn a little longer? How he nursed a broken dream, how much he nursed a broken dream. Should I touch his night with words? Should my lament be stronger? How those who craved autumn's last night were exiled by the spring. How those in spring's light arms were auctioned off as autumn's claim. कितने दीवाने पतझड़ के बहारों में बदनाम हुए और कितने बहारों के आशिक पतझड़ में नीलाम हुए. नाम पते लिखवाऊं क्या? Should I say his name? Should I say each of their names? Would you care to note them down? Should your ink be darker, your hand stronger? Should I mourn a little longer? The shrouds are again leaving my part of the town. My town has again erupted in flames. You will have to listen to the screams of my people. You will have to listen to their names. You will have to keep count. The minister's recommendations lie soaked in blood. सिफारिशें सब मंत्री जी की खून से लथपथ पड़ी हैं. संविधान पर महोदय लाश बनकर ही पड़ी हैं. कह दो तो हरिजनों से बोल कर उठवाऊं क्या? The minister's recommendations lie soaked in blood, stillborn on the pages of the Constitution. Should I close the file, junk the folder? Should I ask the Harijans to carry it on their shoulder as you stand mute? Should I ask the Bahujans to lend their hand? Your silence has always been a warmonger. Should I mourn a little longer? Dhiren Borisa. तो जो क्वेयरनेस के जो फ्रेम्स हैं, जो क्वेयरनेस की वोकैबुलरी है, वो किन किन जगहों से आ सकती है, दिस पोएम sort of exemplifies that. And there was a way in which it was such a humble lesson sort of editing this book and translating this poem, precisely because any kind of definitional paradigm was being broken open for us. And particularly when we realized that this strange thing, this catch-all term, this odd umbrella thing called queerness that we were giving to this book, the content of the book itself never had the confidence of its cover page, A. And B, the content itself was militating against any kind of narrow framework we would give to it, particularly by poets who bring identities which intersect with queerness and make a very distinct living experience. And the Hiren poem, I thought, was startling for that reason as well, among many other reasons.
Meena's going to read her bit.
I have something like a companion poem for that, I think. It's called A Sapphic Scar. These are poems that I have been writing for my new book of poetry. At Dash, a fellow Indian writer I looked up to declared, "You're not bisexual until you've slept with a woman." When I shyly confided in her, several years my senior and a lesbian at that point in time, that I desired both men and women, I felt embarrassed. This felt like the mouth sores of scurvy, the weak soft bones of rickets, a deficiency, a deformity. I had only one lover in the picture at that point in time, but this could be rectified soon, I thought, so I let it slip. I waited for a woman who would ask me out at that point in time. And now it's the second part of the poem. She also told me another day that my presence on the writing program was denominational. She said, without saying in as many words, that I was there because I was low caste, that I came from the margins, that I was picked out because I was different, that I served institutional purposes of diversity. Poets can employ one word to contain a universe of meaning. Denominational meant that I checked some boxes. Denominational meant that I did not have talent. Denominational meant that I did not have merit. Denominational meant that I did not deserve to be there. Denominational meant that I was not one of them, meant that I was not one of the Brahmins, one of those who were born with talent and merit, one of those whom our religion ordained intellectually superior by birth. Even when I was taken in by the American people, I was set apart by the standards of my people. She could have called me token. If this were happening back home, she would have called me quota, category, reservation candidate. This was a barb older than time, older than pronouns. This was not about a particular point in time. A perennial stigma cannot be undone. Sleeping around, sleeping with, not sleeping at all does not solve this insult. Waiting for a man or a woman or a room full of lovers does not help either. Denominational is a deficiency that medicine cannot fix. Denominational is a deformity that surgery cannot touch. Being called denominational is what makes me burn myself, what makes me write word after word in rage, what makes me leave behind this body of work so that someday, in another time, someone else will read me and say, she deserved her place.
So I'm going to kind of mix it up and, what we've decided in this thing. So, I wanted to really talk about, you said this is a book of, you're writing poetry again, and this is after, I think, 12 years, and we were talking about this, right? So I wanted to pick up on two things about this. At one point of time, you talk about, and, Akhil had talked about this idea of queer in poetry, the space that it occupies, and, in some ways, a box that you kind of tick. And I know that, you talked about the experience where, she wasn't lesbian enough. She hadn't had any lesbian experiences, or, she didn't tick the box for the immigration officer. And, I wanted to talk to you really now, moving from there, from ticking a box to the idea, as you say, in poetry, you say poets can employ one word to contain a universe of meanings, right? The economy of word in poetry, and we were talking about that, right? How it's different for prose, where you can, pad it up or say so much thing. But with poetry, it is really, every word counts. There's something more powerful than that. There is, it's political, it's transparent. We were talking about that. And I think, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase from what you had written in a book, where you say that, once you check the box of, say, a queer poet or an anti-caste or a feminist, when you put yourself in this box, you talk about it in your book, where you say that at some point of time, you're not they don't see you as a writer, but they see you as a diarist of an experience. You also talk about, and we were talking about this earlier, about, Acrobat, which was Nabanita Dev Sen's poem, which was translated by her daughter. And she talks about poetry, how women's poetry, for example, is seen as almost confessional, right? As is this experience that happened to them. It sort of ticks off the same thing. When you're a queer poet, it's sort of almost a diarist of experience. You sort of come from that space, and that's the only thing that kind of defines you. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll go into the next thing where you can talk about others and the rape thing. Yeah? So can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Well, I want Akhil to also comment on this, but my very brief comments in terms of, we are not seen as writers, we are seen as diarists who survived.
Right. Yeah.
So, and I think this particular problem exists for women writers. So I think Sophie Collins has a book called Who is Mary Sue, in which like everything that a writer writes is read as, especially for women writers, as own experience. And Nabanita Devsen writes about
poetry and how she can't come to
how
it.
She can't, like it's always seen as her own. I think with Kamala Das as well, we had that. So everything she wrote was read as her own experience. And I have trouble with this word confessional, because confession, in the Catholic Christian sense of the term, is something you do when you sin.
Yeah.
It's not like, okay, I had I had food, that's not confession, right? I walked on the street, that's not confession. So there's always this element of guilt to it. But what if you're actually writing, like two aspects of it? If you're writing about your experience, but being very proud of your experience without having any guilt attached to it, So just owning up to your sexuality, owning up to your sexual experience, your sexual liberation, whatever you call it, without this whole burden. And this other aspect is, why does poetry, like sometimes, I was in a meeting 2 weeks ago, I was speaking on an online conference, and they were like, we're very happy to hear you speak, can you read some poems? And I said, I just cannot switch so quickly because my poetry is very transparent,
Yeah.
So with political work, I can have a certain distance, and then a screen at least, and then with poetry, you're like asking me to suddenly open up, and it's not the same, because you know me well enough, you may know who I'm writing about or what relationships I'm writing about. And I think that that's perhaps
it's more personal.
It's very personal, but it's also, I don't know if it's the blessing or the curse of poetry. But
And the strange thing about, and I'm sure there are lots of folks who would compare notes, the strange thing about queerness is, at this historical juncture, yes, who I desire seems to have some salience for who I am. So let's say if I desire women, I'm straight, or if I desire men, I'm gay. But this kind of combination, that one means the other, happened at a certain point in history, it will stop happening at a certain point in history as well. When, if you read, literature from the subcontinent, same-sex desires cannot be held hostage only to the idea of certain names, right? So if you read Ismat Chugtai or Pandey Bechan Sharma Ugra or Amarkant or Kamleshwar or Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, and there are characters and there are situations and there are excessively delicious scenes of same-sex desire, but they are not within the kind of sign of one kind of name. Right? So all of us, how many of us have read Ismat Chuktai's Lihaf? Or have heard of it? Just heard of it? Right? So there's plenty of people in the room, right? So now about when she wrote Lihaf, which is about this luxurious friction that takes place between Rabbu and Begum Jan, and which is told to us through these eyes of kind of a young narrator. She landed up in an obscenity trial along with Manto in Lahore, and she's there in early 1940s, and she ends up speaking to this one Urdu writer called M. Aslam, and he is very troubled. Why did you write on this scandalous subject matter? And she says at that point, and she's speaking about queerness, I'm using an anachronistic term, she's talking about, मुझे नहीं मालूम था असलम साहब कि लिहाफ वाले मौजू पर लिखना मना है, मुझे नहीं मालूम था इस मर्ज या लत पर लिखना मना है. राइट मेरा तो कलम मतलब अब्दुल रहमान चुगताई का कैमरा है, खट से बटन दब जाता है, जो भी मेरे सामने है वो पेज पर आ जाता है. So in the 1940s, Chugtai, the reader of Freud, Chugtai, the reader of Havelock Ellis, Chugtai, belonging to a family of Urdu letters, is not able to reconcile these two frames. One guiding frame of same-sex desire, which is marz, medical condition of some sort, and lat, इनको तो आदत है, इनके तो नवाबी शौक हैं, ये तो उस लाइन के हैं, इनको लत लग गई है. Those are the kind of frames which are also at work in this Urdu literature, and you might think of it as stultifying, as limiting frames, but they weren't. Like the characters in the book are having the best of times. The characters in the book are flirting, they're seducing each other, they are rubbing oils and perfumes onto each other, and these names, these different ways of signposting same-sex desire, adat, lat, masti, marz, shauq, all this is allowing that to happen, right? And so the subcontinent has a very rich history of idioms and also a very rich history of limitations, where the guiding limitation is not of whether the desire is between the same sex, the guiding limitation is whether you are of the same caste or not, right? And that in one text after another, in one text after another, you'll say the boundary that you're running up against is not whether it happens to be another man, because in one sense, if you are a powerful upper caste man, different kinds of figures, whether men, women, or folks beyond these categories, are in one sense available for pleasure. But if you happen to break the caste contract is when the subcontinent throws hellfire at you, right? And that is something we encountered constantly when we were thinking about histories of queerness in the subcontinent. And the names, I mean, that immigration judge will sort of turn in his grave if he's not there already.
Yes.
The names, there's a startling array of them under which and through which same-sex desire is practiced, thought about, indulged in. Yeah.
So I was, the anthology also looks at, and we've touched on Chugtai, but we touched on, in some ways, translation, and we talked about cross-border, right? And I wanted to talk about that, essentially in some ways, and both of you have done translations of cross borders, where language, of course, is political, so the idea, and we were talking about this at another thing, and you said, I'm so happy that Jerry Pinto is translating something, because, it takes translation to another level, right? Otherwise, you're seen as stenographers, if I'm not listening. And I wanted to talk to you really about that, about translating, whereas in another session, somebody else said that it is like taking perfume from one bottle to another. So the idea and the difficulty in translating that, and could you talk about, both of you, about the difficulty of translating?
I actually just wanted to pick on your earlier point on this one about translation, which is that how do you also retrieve a text and make it like a powerful feminist text, or like I was translating the classical Tamil text from 2000 years ago, which is the Tirukkural. So when you look at this text, there is I will say a Kural. I wanted to avoid the words for husband and wife because they're not in use in the Kural. It's something that translators have imposed on the original text. It's a text of desire. The word for husband and wife doesn't occur in the same way in which translators have used them. But there's also one very, very particular Kural I want to share, which says, Penniyalar yellarum kannin podu unbar, ninnen parathanin marbu, which means she says, and this is where the translation is interesting. When she says penniyalar, it's not women. It's mean those with women in them. So she says all of them are publicly feasting you on your chest. So I am not going to embrace you. Like this is a kind of Tamil love poem where she's quarreling with her lover. She says everybody who has some femininity in them is feasting on your, wonderful figure. So I'm not going to go and embrace you now that you become public property. And I think it was very interesting just to use this word penniyalar, because it doesn't mean textbook woman, doesn't mean cisgendered woman, it doesn't mean you're biologically woman. You could be a man with some femininity attracted to this guy. And I just wanted to open this up. So when I translated, I said, everyone with womanhood publicly feasts their eyes on your chest. So, like just to bring this in, so as a translator, how do you move a text? How do you bring it into this space of, openness? And I also thought, so I think this is an ongoing experiment to push the boundaries as well, Even if it's a 2,000-year-old text, let's do our best to reclaim it. So. Cross-border?
And Akhil, can you talk about that? Yeah.
So this is a South Asian collection. And with different degrees of success, we were able to get poets from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and some other parts of this kind of otherwise a very nebulous category, South Asia. And so I'm just going to read out some names, and I do want you to check them out because I think it's some remarkable work by these poets. Seher Riaz, Sehrish Rashid, Amal Rana, Amar Hamad Khan, Minahil Abidin, Fatima Bhaiji, Hadi Hussain, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Iftikhar Naseem, Asad Alvi, Uruj Zafar, Aqdas Aftab, and Fatima Ashkar. Can I please have a round of applause for these amazing queer Pakistani poets? And all because I'm going to send them the video of this applause later on. But you know, desire can manage, usually desire actually manages to do very little. But I do think it does give you a kind of a softer template, a kind of a softer disposition through which you interact with the world. And especially when we were bringing together this volume and there were extensive, long email and WhatsApp and phone conversations across people spread out in the subcontinent, whether in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and other countries, there was a way in which something was being, something else was transpiring between these two nations, which are otherwise these big boy, big brother, nuclear armed states whose favorite pastime is saber rattling. You know, I mean, just what, yesterday or day before, by mistake missile chala gaya. Like, तो हम तो mistake से भी missile भेजते हैं. तो, and I was trying to contrast with the kind of poetry that the Pakistani poets and the Indian poets in this book were writing. And one of the poets who I swear by, and you should check out their work, Simple Rajra, they wrote a poem in Punjabi, and it was translated by Jasdeep Singh. So I thought I'll read a translation, and here two women, now separated by partition between that Punjab and this Punjab, are thinking of each other. The poem is called Kharidari. What do I not buy? What is this? Ice. I ran barefoot, searched like the mad do. Why didn't you come for the last time? I pined beyond measure. Come, put one slab on my soul. Enna tadpi main. लिया एक सिल्ली मेरी रूह ते रख दे. What is this? Sand? I am not a mausoleum. What do I need these tiny pebbles for? Yes, but the corpse of my desires lies there, empty, the full sack on it. लिया एक बोरी पा दे. What is this? Salt? Traded off when we had to flee from Ratowal, that Punjab, to Nawa Shahar, this Punjab. If you got it from the same woman, put it in my mouth. Te mere muh vich rakh de. What is this? Rain? We got the house from the Muslims, but we kept the Peer's shrine in the backyard intact. If the raindrops are washed from the mazar, get them close to my chest. Te meri chhati na la de. What is this? Fog. Whether from Lahore or Jammu, it won't tell you what lies ahead. If it is the chill from her moist hands, stitch it in my hair. Te mere baal ich siya de. Simple Rajra.
So I wanted Meena to read from her book, which is also about the other, where we see.
This is thanks to Akhil for reading this work. I was translating Tamil Tigresses, you know, women who were in the LTT, who were also poets but also combatants. And as a Tamil person, it's very interesting because in the rest of India, the liberation struggle or the national self-determination struggle of the people of Tamil Eelam is seen as quote-unquote terrorist. Whereas to the people of Tamil Nadu and to the people of Tamil Eelam, it is a self-determination struggle. It is a struggle for liberation. And the reason why I wanted to translate the poetry of the women gorillas particularly was because there was this narrative that has stayed saying these were brainwashed women, these were women, you know, who were taken in or were trapped and then, you know, made into fighters, but their poetry attests to anything except that. So I thought that, we are talking all the time about the poet who is the activist, the poet who goes and holds a placard, the poet who is signing a petition, but these were like fighters who were poets. They need to also be celebrated as literature. So this is a poem from Captain Vanati. She died when she was less than 20 in the battle for Elephant Pass. And this is a poem that she's writing to other women. Get ready for battle. You who have become a refugee in your kitchen because of the storm of patriarchy. You waging a silent war with fire. Get ready and come. Let your self-confidence grow and your courage too. Do you have any freedom to act on your thoughts and your desires? Family life does not exist for the have-nots now. This is what has continued into the 20th century. Like the dreams of someone mute, your emotions now run silent. You sob in the kitchen as you're being wrapped. Get ready and come away. Let us create a new era in the shadow of the guns we now carry. When we get national freedom that we desire so deeply, we will build the tomb for women's exploitation. We will dig the graves for society's backward ideas. For this revolution tomorrow, you must come today. Look, there, in a flood of blood, your sister holding a gun out to you. Take her weapon, walk in her footsteps. So,
I'm opening up this question. So, I'm going to open it up for questions. I know we've about only 6 minutes. I'm sure there are lots of questions. The gentleman who's wearing a mask right at the back.
Thank you, and adab to everyone. I'm from Lucknow. My name is Abhijit Singh, and I'm baptized. I'm baptized again, and I'm just too overwhelmed to say anything. My request is from Akhil Ji. Can you please read Kazim Ali's poem from that book? Would you please? Thank you.
Anybody else who has questions, just put your hands up and the mic will come so that we don't.
This is for you, both of us from Lucknow, from one Lucknow wala to another. Kazim Ali, exit strategy. I hear the sound of the sprinkler outside, not the soft kind we use to run through, but the hard kind that whips in one direction, then cranks back and starts again. Last night, we planned to find the white argument of the Milky Way, but we are 20 years too late. Last night, I cut the last stargazer lily to wear in my hair. This morning, the hardest geography quiz I've ever taken. How does one carry oneself from mountain to lake to desert without leaving anything behind? Perhaps I ought to have worked harder. Perhaps I could have paid more attention. A mountain I didn't climb, music I yearned for but could not achieve. I travel without maps, freestyle my scripture, pretend the sky is an adequate representation of my spiritual beliefs. The sprinkler switches off, the grass will be wet. I haven't even gotten to page 2 of my life and I'm probably more than halfway through. Who knows what kind of a creature I will become. Kazim Ali.
Okay. So we have only 4 minutes. I know the questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Stuti, and throughout the session as it started, all I could keep thinking is, what does it mean to me to, have a queer poem be read out in public, right? That even as an audience, I am being perceived as queer, right? And even as an audience, the public listening of it constitutes a betrayal of, what my identity is. It betrays who I am to, people around me, to people who can perceive me over here. So I think my question to the both of you is that, what does like a public reading of a queer poem mean to you, which would otherwise happen in private, away from like where you can be perceived?
I mean, obviously one's relationship to this event, this entity called the queer poem being read out in public, that relationship to that event has changed over a period of time. What felt like something which could give you goosebumps, what felt like something which was so remarkable that you had pursed your lips and you didn't have a word to say because you were that overwhelmed, has thankfully, over a period of several years, has become as obvious as air. Right? So queer people are everywhere. They are reading. They're reading their hearts out. They're putting in front of us conversations which folks were not having. I do think the kind of queer poems that we should now read, think about, converse with each other is which also call into questions some of the guiding assumptions within the queer community, right? And that is precisely the fault lines of caste and class, which are at work on every step of this thing we call queerness. If you go to one city's Pride March, you won't be allowed to have political slogans. If you switch on your grinder and your name's abbreviation is SC, दूसरा वाला आपकी जात पूछेगा. People are putting in their, your Bharat matrimony and our matrimonials, they're nothing else but Jat. Punjabi Khatri bharatmatrimony.com. Rajput, Kayasth, Brahman bharatmatrimony.com. वो सारा queer लोग भी practice कर रहे हैं. तो क्वेयर लोग भी जब एक दूसरे के साथ अपना आइडियल मैच ढूंढ रहे हैं तो वो भी जात के लेंस से एक दूसरे को देख रहे हैं. I think those poems which call into question this crap are the ones which we need to listen to. And I think after this initial euphoria, after this initial euphoria will die down, and after we'll grow with these poems, I think those are the questions we'll be asking. Because when Dr. Siras won the court case, it was between the Delhi High Court judgment 2009 judgment and before the Supreme Court sort of reversed it in 2013. So there are legal events which can constitute our history, but there are far more trenchant social everyday lives which have to change for even those legal events to make any real sense in our lives, no? So I think that, yeah. तो लेकिन overwhelmed होते हैं, लेकिन ज़्यादा देर के लिए overwhelmed भी नहीं होना चाहिए.
So one last question, okay? The lady in front.
We've talked about the experience of different marginalized groups here and the further intersection of DBA queer people. So have you ever felt that our experience of queerness, which is much different than our Western counterparts, is being submerged because we use and borrow their terminology in queer discourse and in academic discourse? Like, it's a privilege for us to even know that we can call ourselves queer. There are many people in India that don't have the words in their native language that don't have derisive connotations. So like, is using their terminology submerging our identity?
No, I don't. See, one thing is people are not waiting for words to live their lives, right? So people have always lived their lives in different capacities and different ways. And words become useful. Words do become useful crutches at some point. But it's not that, for instance, queer lives, however we imagine it, queer lives in the 16th century in the subcontinent, or queer lives in the 8th century in Europe, or queer lives in southern Africa in the 11th century, surely are being lived with a different panoply, a kind of maddening slew of different kinds of names and ways of thinking. When we sent out the call for this book and we asked, we were trying to be as exhaustive in the list of names that we had set up for this volume, and we had said, we are inviting entries from trans men, trans women, lesbian, hijra, kothi, gay, aravani, khwajasara, intersex, jogappa, bisexual, drag king, queen, genderqueer, non-binary, meili, chele, butch, femme. And we thought we were being fairly exhaustive in the list of any kind of name through which a person thinks of themselves in a rich manner. And then immediately we said, folks responded to us said, but where are the asexuals and where are the pansexuals? Our folks from Tamil Nadu said, where are the Tirunangais? Friends from Manipur said, hello, Nupi Manbi and Nupa Manva are not here. And they said, don't translate it as Indian trans woman, translate it as indigenous Métis trans woman from Manipur. So I don't think it's a particular privilege to have only some names in the sense of gay, lesbian, and other people who are not using those names are living in some kind of dead end or some kind of lack. I think everyone figures out negotiation, and queerness, just that negotiation is explicit. Yeah.
Thank you so much.